working in a Chinese factory, peddling, then who else is going to live here? Because and then she would put the vegetables out, and all the Jews in general, because I can't necessarily understand it, or in 1933 there were over 500,000 Jews in Germany.
Well, good evening. Thank you for coming to attend this and to listen to our story. So I want to start with giving you a broad sort of perspective on this. Although this is a personal family story relating to how I and my parents and one set of grandparents and two sets of aunts and uncles managed to escape from the Holocaust and find refuge in Shanghai, China for 8 years. However, it's also part of a larger story, which in fact involved 20,000 or so people who were able to do the same thing. And on the table behind me, there are some books and some documentary films that have been made about this story called Escape to the Rising Sun and so forth. And the reference to the Rising Sun is the fact that we were there under Japanese occupation during World War II. So all of this will come out, and so let's get started. So both of my parents, who were born Ivan Hans Haas, he was later known as John Haas in this country, and my mother, who was born Gerda Buchheim, were both born in Berlin, Germany, and they were both born to German Jewish families that had histories going back hundreds of years in Germany. And so first we want to show you a bit about my father's family. That's just a map showing us where Berlin is.
That's Europe, and then we highlighted Berlin for you.
So let's go to so the upper left-hand picture is a family gathering in the 1920s. In the center, my grandparents, and eventually 9 of the people in that photograph were murdered in the Holocaust. And the picture on the lower left is a family picture, and in the front are my father, his 2 sisters, and his younger brother. And of the 2 sisters, one of them also managed to get to Shanghai. The other one and her husband actually went to India and survived in India. And the other person, though, is my father's younger brother, whose name was Herbert, and he's in the center photo. And Herbert was 23 years old. His wife was 21, and they were attempting to make it to what was then Palestine, and they were picked up, and eventually they also were murdered in Auschwitz. And the picture on the right is just to sort of demonstrate the rich sort of family life that my parents had.
Yeah, I have a million.
Okay.
Hold it close, Henry.
I will, thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Your daughter said that
My
too.
name is Gerda Haas. I was born in Berlin on April 11th, 1914.
So this is an excerpt from my mother's filmed oral history. We're going way ahead, Katie. That was my mother introducing herself, and this slide shows you her family. The upper left-hand corner is, again, a family gathering, and eventually, no, I'm sorry, that's my mother and her parents. The lower picture is the family gathering, and eventually 6 of those people ended up in Auschwitz. The center photo are my mother's parents, my grandparents, whom I never met because although they had the opportunity to also leave and to go to Shanghai, they did not. And they did not because my grandfather served as a German soldier in the First World War, and that's his uniform. And he believed that he would be safe. And eventually, in 1943, they were among the last people deported from Berlin to Auschwitz. And then the picture on the right is just my mother and her sister and her mom. So this slide shows you my mother as a young woman in Germany in the 1930s. On the left is a picture again with her mother and her sister. In the middle, she's decked out. The upper right-hand picture is a school photo. My mother's ambition was to be a school teacher, and with the German restrictions, the laws that went into effect in 1935, she was no longer permitted to go to university, so she had to drop out. And the slide on the right, the lower one, is my mother's driver's license at age 18 in Nazi Germany, and you can see the official Nazi stamp on that document.
The swastika. So how did we get to this situation? You can see that after World War I, there was the Treaty of Versailles, and in June of 1919, when that was signed, that imposed crippling reparations on Germany. So coincidentally, at the very same time, there was a global economic depression from 1919 to 1921, and German money became worthless and unemployment skyrocketed. And I remember my mother-in-law telling me her father, who was a kosher butcher, that he had a wheelbarrow and he would take the money he'd taken in during the days in a wheelbarrow to the bank. That's how people were having to pay at that time. And of course, everybody has to look for someone to blame, so they blamed the socialists, the communists, and of course, the Jews. The Jews were used as a scapegoat, and anti-Semitism increased. And you can see in the up here, Treaty of Peace, the Allied and Associate Powers dealing with Germany, and the treaty was between France and Great Britain. And what you see in 1932 in the picture on the right, which is a bit hard to decipher, but that's a big, long unemployment line in Hamburg, and the text on the wall with the red arrows pointing to a warehouse, it says, "Vote Hitler." So what happened was that people voted for the Nazi Party. It wasn't specifically voting for Hitler, they voted for the Nazi Party. And once the Nazi Party had won the majority, the party appointed Hitler to be the chancellor. And once he was in that position, he established what he called the Ermächtigungsgesetz, which means the Enabling Act. And with the Enabling Act, this granted Hitler emergency powers, and he went to town with that.
Okay, so as all this is happening in the 1930s, and you have to bear in mind, my parents are still young people in their early 20s, and they're trying to go about their business, but my dad sensed that maybe somehow they might have to leave at some point. And what this document is about is that my grandfather, his dad, came to Germany from Czechoslovakia, and according to the law, my father was eligible for Czechoslovakian citizenship. So in 1933, he applied for it, he obtained this citizenship for 10 years, and that's the document. Later on, it became valuable that he did that. All right, so as I said, my parents are still trying to live their lives. And in 1935, at ages 21, 25, they were married. And then they stayed, and you fast forward to 1938, 3 years later. I am born in Germany. That's my birth certificate. You can see the Nazi stamp on it again. The other thing perhaps to note is that my given name was Henry, which is not a German name. And the reason for that is that my parents knew they were going to leave to go someplace at that point in time. So they chose that name. Had they not had the Czechoslovakian citizenship, they would not have been allowed to give me this name. It would have been Heinrich, or whatever the German name would have been.
So actually, just to augment what Henry just said, my mother-in-law paid no attention to politics. She couldn't be bothered. But he wasn't university educated, but he was very street smart, plugged into what was going on, and he had wanted to leave long before they finally left. And that's part of the reason that he got the Czech certificate, because he said, I smell a rat. It's not going to be good. We have to have some alternatives available. So later years, my mother-in-law said, if it hadn't been for Joan, I wouldn't be here, because I wanted to stay. So there they are living in Berlin, and what they do is Gerda and her husband and baby Henry escaped to Nitra, which is in Slovakia, and they were able to do that because his grandpa Samuel Haas was from Slovakia, which it used to be Czechoslovakia, but it was Slovakia then. And then they stayed there for a short while, and the Gestapo showed up already at that time. We were shooting people, going into hotels, finding the Jewish men, and literally murdering them with no repercussions whatsoever. So then they leave Nitra and they go to Prague, which is the Czech Republic. It's a beautiful city. It never got bombed during the war. That's why there's a lot of beautiful buildings there still. So they made their way to Prague, and he was right to leave, because what happened in November of 1938 was what we call Kristallnacht, which is the night of broken glass. They had hundreds of synagogues were burned. There was looting and destruction of many Jewish homes, schools, and community offices. 7,500 Jewish businesses were vandalized. Jews were beaten, and more than 90 people were killed. And you see the shattered storefront of a Jewish-owned shop in Berlin, and then that's Baden-Baden in Germany, which is in South Germany, and it's a synagogue in flames, and then Ober-Ramstadt is in flames also. So anti-Semitism is simply prejudice against or hatred of Jews. And it existed in Europe for hundreds of years because Christianity blamed the Jews for Jesus' death. And the church encouraged that, both the Protestant and the Catholic churches. So the Nazis and the Nazi Party considered themselves Aryans, a distinct European race. And Hitler wanted to preserve racial purity, and Jews was considered to be a threat to that purity. The Nazis used the Jews and other minorities as a scapegoat. And on the left, you see Hitler and Himmler reviewing SS troops in Nuremberg in 1935. And this picture, 1938 in Vienna, Austria, there's a dog sitting on a bench, and it's labeled Nur für Arier, which means only for Aryans. So only Aryans and dogs or cats could sit on the bench, but not Jews. Okay.
All right, so actually, we were in Prague for about, was it 9 months? We were there for quite a while. But eventually, the Germans came and then took over in Prague. And so this slide on the left just shows us in Prague with me in that baby carriage during that period. The right hand is Hitler reviewing troops in Prague. And so at this point, we needed to leave Prague and figure out where we were going next.
So there they were in Prague. They still had family in Berlin, and there were a lot of decisions to be made. So what happened was Gerda went back to Berlin with Henry and to say goodbye to her parents because her father had refused to leave. And then from Berlin, John, Henry's dad, went from Prague to Aachen, which is on the Belgian border. And why am I so good at these things? I'm good at it because I grew up in England and traveled in Europe, so I know where all the countries are. So once he was in Aachen, he then made his way to Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, he sold his furs because he'd been a furrier. He was in the fur business. And he did that because they wanted money to be able to get away. Then he actually made his way from Amsterdam to Paris, and a lot of it included him walking. He had to sort of keep a very low profile, so he wasn't picked up. And at one point, he was picked up by a Belgian policeman, because they thought he was a vagrant, and they put him in jail. And then the next morning, the policeman's talking to him and says, "Well, where are you going?" And he said, "Paris." And he said, "Why are you wandering around?" He said, "I'm Jewish." He said, "Oh my God." Took his key, let him out, and said, "Off you go to Paris." So not everybody was a bad actor at that time. And in Paris was his uncle Richard in English, whom we met in 1963. Very suave, sophisticated guy who actually survived the Holocaust, which was very interesting. That's a story in itself. So what happened to Gerda was she left Berlin. She made it to Salzburg with her mother, and that's where she said goodbye to her mother. Her mother went back to Berlin, and she went on from Salzburg with Henry's paternal grandfather, Samuel Haas, to a little village on the Italian Riviera, such as it is, called Alassio. And my mother-in-law and I went there with our 2 older children to revisit it at one point. So a lot of Jews were hiding in Alassio because they were trying to get out of Europe. So what happened with Gerda was an Italian fisherman told her and the other young Jewish men who were hiding in Alassio, I will smuggle you into France, because the young Jewish men wanted to get into France. Then they would walk from France into Spain and make their way to Lisbon in where they could actually get on ships safely. Portugal, that's the country, of course. So she gets on the boat with Henry, he's an infant, and all the young Jewish men say, you have to get off the boat, you're going to give us away, he's going to cry. And she said, no, I will keep him quiet. So everybody settled down, and then in the early morning hours, he dropped them off on a beach and said, okay, now you're in France. They had to take his word for that, right? So what they did was they walked back up into the hills, which he told them to do, and he said, you will come to a white house, knock on the door, and the lady there will help you. So they just had to follow that with their fingers crossed. They get to the White House, and the young men say to my mother-in-law, you speak French, none of us speak French, you knock on the door, because if it was a trap, they might think you're one of the local ladies out walking around with her baby. So she knocks on the door, and an old French lady, all dressed in black, of course, which is what they did then, opened the door, and there was a French calendar on the wall. So she said, it's okay, we're here. So the old lady said, come in. She fed them, and the French underground, which was operating even at that time, arrived and picked them up from there and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take you to Nice, and in Nice, you, Mrs. Haas, can get on the train to go to Paris with your son. Whatever you do on the train, don't change his diaper, because he was circumcised, and non-Jewish boys were not circumcised. And with the other young men, they took them to Nice and then found their ways to get them into Spain so they could escape. The Italians and the French were not very keen on the Nazis, to say the least. So they got to Paris.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're together again, and we're all in Paris after whatever, 15 months or so. And the document on the screen is a letter in French from a Jewish assistance organization, which says your tickets to Shanghai are ready, you can come pick them up. We need to take a minute here now to just talk about Shanghai and what was it that allowed 20,000 people to enter Shanghai between 1937 and the beginning of 1941. First of all, there was no place else in the whole world to go. You could not get a visa, you could not get a legal immigration. Just as an aside, for the United States at that time, the entire quota for the country of Germany was 25,000 people. And historically, if you read about it, there were also some things going on within the State Department, which we won't get into, with relationship to rescuing the Jews of Europe who were trying to find a place to go. So, the proposition about Shanghai is this. The Chinese fought two wars in the 1800s, about 1855 and about 1880 or thereabouts, with the French and the English. They were called the Opium Wars. And they were actually, the Chinese were trying to prevent the importation of opium into China by those countries. They lost those wars. There were treaties made, and as part of those treaties, the Chinese had to concede that there were certain ports that would be free, open ports without restriction, and anybody could come in and out. And one of those was a little section in Shanghai called the International Sector. And that's exactly where the boats landed with the refugees coming in, mostly from Western Europe. So that's the story about why we were able to go to Shanghai. And the picture on the right is the actual ship that we were on, with a total of about 2,000 people that were taking the journey to Shanghai from France and going into the unknown. This depicts the route. It was a 3-week voyage. It started in Marseille, France, and went to Egypt through the Suez Canal, to move to Colombo, Saigon, Hong Kong, and eventually into Shanghai. This slide on the upper left is a picture, actually the one above and below, of taking on board that ship. And I'm in the picture, and literally those people in the picture had no idea what they were going to or what they were going to find when they got there. And then on the upper right is a picture that shows the typical ship arriving in the port of Shanghai as it looked in the lower right. Okay, next.
It was the very beginning of August, and it was kind of 15 degrees, and the flies and the mosquitoes and the dirt and the bells was just awful. And I was allowed to take a rickshaw because it was Shabbos, so I was allowed to take a rickshaw to send me. And I didn't say we had the second experience with the rickshaw there. We felt bad that human beings would pull us. We didn't like that. But they said they make a living with it, and that's the way it is. So we went to the place where my mother-in-law had cooked dinner and expected us, and she was also a very strong and positive person, like her son, and said, it's not that bad. You're all here together, and you just keep the talk, so we'll get used to it. So she kind of consoled that young one.
All right, so I need to interject something now. So the question was, where were we going to live? How were we going to live? Where were we going to go? And so at the time that we arrived, there were, first of all, we went to a little section of Shanghai that was called, within this international sector, but it was called Hongqiu. And most of the refugees were in that sector, although some who had money when they came were able to go to other sectors of Shanghai. There was a French sector, an English sector, and they would rent apartments, but we didn't have any money. And so at that point in time, which is again is in late 1939, there were 2 huge refugee camps in that sector. So the choice was you could go live in a refugee camp, and it was like a football fields full of beds, one beside the other, with sheets dividing. That was the only privacy. And there was a food kitchen, and so you could go there, and there were relief organizations that were handling that. The other option was to go out into the Chinese population within that sector and rent a room, a single room, to live in with no kitchen, no toilet facilities. And that's what my father and mother decided to do. And so we ended up living in a single room about 10 by 14 or so for the entire 8 years. And that's how I grew up. But I didn't know any different. My parents obviously did. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't refer to the pictures themselves. The upper right hand is a document of mine, an identity document, later in the 40s, and it's in English and Chinese, and the thing that sticks out is that there's a line up there which says duration of stay, and it says uncertain. And of course it said uncertain because nobody knew how long was this going to go on and when would it end and so forth. The lower left hand is a family picture, my grandparents, my parents and I, and on the right is my aunt and uncle and my cousin, and then on the right is the boxing picture, and essentially what that's about is that it was fairly rough on the streets of Shanghai, and my father enrolled me in a boxing club so that I could learn how to defend myself. That was what that was about. The other picture on the right is a Boy Scout picture. It's not me. They had Boy Scouts because of the influence of the English in Shanghai, and there's a fellow in that picture who lives in Seattle, who's a lifelong friend of mine, who was there in Shanghai with me. He was a couple of years older. So more Shanghai pictures. The lower left picture is my school picture, a school picture from Shanghai. The red arrow is me. The school I went to was organized by the refugee community. It was taught in German, and it was taught according to rather strict European standards of that time. And in fact, when I came to the States, it ultimately turned out that I had a very good basic education that was valuable, and the upper right-hand corner is just a family picture again, and the lower right hand is a fun thing at a soccer game in Shanghai.
So I want to augment what Henry was saying. That is called the Kadoorie School. Now, there were Jews living in China, believe it or not, for quite some time, and they were mostly Sephardic Jews. Ashkenazi Jews are Western European. Sephardic Jews come from North Africa and Spain and Greece. So there's a distinction in the Jewish community about that. The Kadoorie family and the Sassoon family, and I'm sure you've all heard of the Sassoons, they managed to get out eventually when the communists came, and they went to Hong Kong and England. But the school was funded by this Kadoorie family because they'd lived there for several hundred years and they were very wealthy, and they wanted to help the refugee children. And the picture in the top right says John as a drummer in Shanghai. Now the fellow who you saw with the hat on was the Boy Scouts. His name was Rolf Preuss, and his father was a musician, and he'd been in Berlin, and he was actually a professional musician, and he was a good friend of John's. So my father-in-law had a very good tenor voice and was known for being able to sing well. So he said to John, because what John was doing was he was working in a Chinese factory, pedaling on a stationary bicycle to make electricity for the factory. So he said, I'm sure you're tired of pedaling away there. Why don't you come? We'll teach you how to play the drums, and you can be part of our band, and you can sing. Now, who were they entertaining? They were actually entertaining the Japanese officers and army people who were there. If you ever want to understand about that whole setup, Spielberg made a movie called Land of the Rising Sun, and it's about a little British boy in Shanghai at this time period, and what happened when the Japanese actually they were dug in around Shanghai, waiting to take it over, and then you see what happens to the little British boy. It's a very good movie. So just to let you know that when Henry and I were engaged, we went out to Steve's Gay 90s with his parents. And many of you may remember Steve's Gay 90s, which was out on 54th and South Tacoma Way. And it was a restaurant, and it had a band, and it had a little show. And so his parents had taken us out for a meal. And the band saw him and said, "John, you have to come up and sing." So he said, "Okay, I will go up and sing." That's how he was. So he went up, and they said, "What are you going to sing?" He said, "I'm going to sing My Blue Heaven in Japanese." And everybody cheered. So he started singing, and I turned to Henry and said, "That really does sound like Japanese." And he said, "It is Japanese." I said, "How does he know how to sing in Japanese?" He said, "It's a very long story. I'll tell you one day."
Okay, I think we need to move on.
Yeah. So you see, this is Pearl Harbor Day. If you watch the Spielberg movie, you will see in that movie how the Japanese army is dug in around Shanghai. They hadn't moved in, but on Pearl Harbor Day, they moved in and they took over. And you see the Japanese troops marching through the streets of Shanghai in 1941. And there's a Shanghai ghetto boundary sign, which if you go to Shanghai, you can see that.
You need to do the pop-out.
Okay. So what happened was, in 1943, there was a Nazi general in Tokyo, General Meisinger, and he flew that winter to meet with the Japanese commander of the army and said, "There are 20,000 Jews here, and we want you to exterminate all of them." And the Japanese fellow was much more sophisticated than the Nazi and said, "Oh, I don't think we can really do that." And they went back and forth and back and forth. And so finally, the Japanese commander said, "I got to get this guy out of here." So what he said to him was, "Here's what we'll do. We will set a designated area for reasons of military necessity for stateless refugees, and we will call them stateless refugees, and we will put them in Hongqiu, the area of the international settlement." Well, Henry was already living there, but there were other people, Jews living throughout Shanghai, and when we went back actually in 1997, on our tour, there was a lady who was touring with us, and she said, "Hör mal auf, bitte." Yeah? Okay.
She's telling me in German to stop, secondly.
I speak German, he speaks
We gotta
German.
move on.
She knows. That's our daughter here. So he said, "Well, we can't really do that. So this is what we're going to do as a compromise." And the General Meisinger was very upset, but he went back to Tokyo, and there was nothing he could do about it because they were not about to murder 20,000 Jews. Okay.
All right, so the impact of what you just saw was that what was a de facto ghetto, in other words, the area that majority of the Jews were in was less than a square mile, and you could go move about freely in and out. And so when this 1943 declaration was made, they fenced it off, and everybody that was living on the outside, I mentioned earlier, there were some people with funds that lived in the French sector, they had to move in. And so now all of us were literally in an actual ghetto because you could not freely go in and out unless you had a pass from a Japanese official. So this went on now throughout World War II. Then, I think as everybody knows, World War II ends in 1945, but we're again in a position where we cannot simply buy a ticket to go go to wherever, we again have to have a place to go, and this time around we need to do it with a visa. We need to have permission from someplace. And it took 2 years after the end of World War II until 1947 that we were able to get visas to come to the United States. I would throw in one other thing with regard to World War II in 1945, towards the end of it, when the Americans were bombing Japan. They came across Shanghai. They actually dropped bombs in the sector where we were. So there was a period where there was actual bombing. There were about, I think, 150 or so of the refugees that were killed by shrapnel. And the reason was that in that sector, the Japanese had a military installation. And they also had a munitions factory, and that's why the bombing occurred. So anyway, now we're 1947. I am just almost 9 years old, and we finally get our visa to come to the United States. And the ship that we came on is the one that's actually pictured. It happened to be the Jewish holiday of Passover during our voyage. And the ship captain, and there were about 250 or so of the refugees from Shanghai, and the ship captain arranged what's called a Seder, a feast for celebration of Passover, and on the right is a letter of thanks to the ship captain for arranging that, which is a document that my mother retained. Okay. So this is the voyage that we took, and from Shanghai, the first stop was Yokohama, Japan, post-World War II, but we were not allowed to get off the ship. And then we went to Honolulu, Hawaii, where in fact we were allowed to get off the ship. That shows you how Waikiki Beach looked at that time, and I actually went swimming there, although I had no bathing suit, so I'm told I went in my underwear. Next, please. Well, yeah, we went to San Francisco. So this slide shows you on the left what the streets of Shanghai would have looked like at that time, and on the right, that shows you the foot of the cable car turnaround in San Francisco, and the red arrow is where we were put up for about a week or 10 days while the decision was made where were we going to go in the United States. There was a little hotel there called the Powell Hotel, and for right now it's my turn to deviate from the script for just a minute, but I don't usually do it.
She does.
She gets the liberty to do it all the time. So anyway, for years when we were in San Francisco, I would need to go to the Powell Hotel, and what I would do is it's a small place, I just open the door, go in, I sort of look around, and that's all I would do. And after doing that for a period of time, I said, one of the days I think I'll get arrested because the clerk or somebody is going to say, this little guy keeps coming in here and he must be up to something no good. But anyway, I actually did it in 2021 when we were there, but it's no longer the Powell Hotel.
It's changed.
Okay.
So here's what the outcome was for German Jews. In 1933, there were over 500,000 Jews in Germany, 523,000. By 1939, 214,000 Jews had escaped from Germany. They'd made it either to Shanghai, or a lot of them went to South America, Argentina, Brazil. We have cousins in Brazil, Bogota, Colombia. And in late 1942 was the deportation of those remaining Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau and Theresienstadt. Overall, throughout Europe, there were 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust, not only in the gas chambers, but with teams of Nazi soldiers who made them dig big pits, and then they would shoot them so they'd fall into it, and then they'd cover them up. And 55 members of Henry's direct family were murdered during the Holocaust. And what we also have up here is these two certificates that you can see is a picture of his maternal grandmother, Paula Buchheim, and her husband, Max Buchheim. And those were sent by his mother to Yad Vashem, which is the memorial museum in Israel. And she wanted them to be remembered as having been murdered by the Nazis. And of course, at the entrance to Auschwitz, it says Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes you free. So that was part of the duping. And here you see Hungarians. They weren't generally picked up till 1944 because Hungary was a whole different ballgame at that time, historically. But in 1944, they were picked up and taken to Auschwitz.
Well, all right, so again, we're in San Francisco, where do we go? And we have no money. I think we had the equivalent of about $90, and my parents did not speak English. I knew a few words, but not very much. So there was, again, a Jewish assistance organization which said if you go to either Phoenix, Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington, we will give you some assistance for a period of time. But if you choose to go to the East Coast, then you're on your own. And my mother did have some relatives there who were willing to help. My father, being who he was, said, no, I don't want to do that. So we had the choice. My father and mother picked Portland, Oregon, and I'm told the reason was they knew nothing, but they saw some pictures, and there was lots of trees and greenery, and it reminded them of southern Germany, and so we went to Portland, Oregon. So that was the first place. I went into the 4th grade in Portland. We were there for 3 years, and then 3 years later, my father, being who he was, opens up a little store in Centralia, Washington, called the Centralia Outdoor Store, where he sold jeans, cowboy hats, cowboy boots, and that sort of thing. And I land in Centralia. I'm 12 years old, and I say these days I transitioned from the streets of Shanghai to the streets of Centralia at that time. So, but I liked Centralia. It was good too. So we were there for 5 years. That closed up, and then the question was, where do we go? And again, my dad says, I know a guy, and I heard there's a guy in Tacoma that's got a little place that he wants to sell. So he and I drove to Tacoma. We landed at 13th and Market Street. There's a little hole-in-the-wall thing, and he decides to buy it, and so we land here. And by this time, I'm 17, and I end up at Stadium High School, and one of the first people I met sitting right there, Fred Warning.
Fred Warning.
So, and we've been friends ever since. Okay. So these pictures, I won't go into any detail. They're just growing up pictures during the period of time that I just talked about. 1954.
52.
Oh, well, you have to pardon my age. Yes, I forgot. 52. so 5 years, that's true. 5 years after we arrived, we became citizens, and that's my citizenship certificate. So these are some more pictures. In the upper left is graduation from Stadium. From Stadium, I went on to UPS for 3 years, and from UPS, after 3 years, I went to law school at the University of Washington. Left hand is my graduation time from law school, and Then along the way, I met a young lady who was 19 years old who came to Tacoma to visit her Aunt Winnie and Uncle Lawrence, who lived on North 7th and Proctor Street. And here we are 62 years later, and that's our wedding picture.
Yep.
We were married in a typical Jewish ceremony. So I think Kate already mentioned we took one trip back to Shanghai, and that was in 1997. That was 50 years after I arrived in the States. And the picture you're looking at of me and those Chinese children was taken where we lived. To the right, there is a doorway, and that doorway goes into the building where that room was located that I mentioned. The room was still there. There was a Chinese couple living there. We met them. It turned out that her parents, the lady's parents, moved into the room when we left in 1947, and then they took over the room. So.
I want to say something about the room because we went back to that room, and when we met this Chinese lady and our Chinese interpreter talked about the fact that he had grown up there, she started crying, and we said, "Why is she crying?" And she said, "Because he was the little white boy I saw when my parents moved in here." So it really moved her. But the other thing I wanted to say was, ironically, when we walked in the door to climb the stairs, Henry said, "Oh my goodness, look, they installed a toilet." There was no toilet when they lived there. What they had was a bucket up on the roof with an umbrella next to it. And every morning, Henry stood up on top of that building and he said in 1997, "I can hear the Chinese guy coming down this alley with his cart." And I said, "What was that?" He said, "All the Chinese took their honey pots and we took our bucket and we had to dump the night soil into his oh, this is pretty awful, into his cart. And of course, he would run to the Huangpo River and dump it all in the river." So, but that's what they did. That's what they had for a toilet. That was it. And they didn't take a bath in 8 years. They just had, stripped down and washed with a washcloth, and that was it. It was really quite something. The other thing for cooking, they couldn't cook in there. So, but where his grandparents lived, his grandma had a kitchen, she could cook. But his mother would take her soup can and go every day to what they called the joint. The Joint Distribution Committee was a refugee organization which still exists in New York. We were there recently, and they would make big pots of soup, and you see them now in Gaza where they're dishing out soup. Well, that's what they did for Henry. They dished out soup into his mother's pot, and she came home and they got to eat soup. So it was, and the other thing I wanted to say is when they ended up in Portland, they ended up with a one-bedroom apartment, and Henry looked around and he said, "Who else is going to live here?" Because he was used to just one little room. And his mother said, "It's for us." He said, "All this for us?" So it's quite a contrast to how we live in America now.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
And she's looking at me.
Entitled children.
Katie, can I make some explanation
Yeah.
of this? Okay, so what you're looking at here is 2015 pictures, and This is in the city of Berlin. Now, we've been back there 5 times, and I will tell you that there's been every effort made to memorialize what happened in the Holocaust in that city. One of the things that the Berlin government, as well as other cities and towns throughout Germany, put into effect is that if you could document where a Holocaust victim lived, you could have a little plaque implanted in the sidewalk adjacent to where they lived. They call them Stolpersteine, which basically means stumbling stones, but the city will do that for you. So we went back in 2015 and we implanted these remembrance stones in the sidewalk for my grandparents as well as my uncle, the younger brother that I mentioned. And it was quite an event. We actually coupled it with, there's a school now on the on where the apartment house was, and we teamed up with the school and we had a big program, and it was very wonderful. But that's what these are about. Katie.
Yep. So we talked about family members that managed to escape, and we're showing you where they all ended up. Bogota, Colombia, Rio de Janeiro, that's an interesting town. Johannesburg, Durban, of course in Israel. There's one cousin who lived in Calcutta, where they managed to escape, lives in Kfar Saba in Israel now. And we have relatives in Manchester and Paris and Neuilly in Switzerland, which is near Geneva. And you can see, we have family to visit all over the world. And so we have, yes.
Just go ahead, Katie.
That we shouldn't have any prejudice, that every human being, no matter color, creed, religion, are the same as we are. We have to, the future generations have to see to that, not especially against Jews, that any discrimination against people. And of course, since we are Jewish, we want to keep our religion and people alive. We have to watch out that this can never happen again. Life is precious. Nobody has the right to take it away from another person.
Okay, one more. Go ahead.
That's when we were in Berlin again in 2019, and there was a big memorial display in the Berlin, what used to be East Berlin, but it's now Berlin General, City Hall, which is a red building, very beautiful. And that was us in front of that, and they had picked Henry and his mother to feature along with some other people.
Can I make an explanation?
Yes.
Okay. Bottom line is there was an exhibit in Berlin, and I was invited to go to that exhibit because they featured 5 stories in that exhibit, and this was one of them. So that's why we went back again. This photo is on my mother's 90th birthday, and it shows our reconstituted family in the States. We had 3 children. One of them happens to be here today, Kim, sitting in the front row. She's in the picture. And we had 4 grandchildren. One of them had not been born yet at the time. I pasted the picture in there. Okay. So that's it. Thank you. If you have the energy to stay or you want to stay and you want to ask some questions, we'll certainly answer them. And I need to direct them to Kate because she has to take them and tell me what the question is.
I can hear better than him.
Okay, so I have a question. So you said when Henry and Gerda were leaving, Gerda went back home to say goodbye to her dad,
Her mother and father, yeah.
But did I hear you say her mother went with them
To Salzburg.
to Salzburg, just basically to say goodbye
Yes.
and bring her there? But then she went
And
back
she took a
with
train
her father.
back, yeah,
So, yeah.
right. Yes?
Any other questions?
How did the economy develop in the ghetto, and how do people survive? Just on relief, or?
Okay, did any kind of economy develop in the ghetto? How did people survive?
Okay. Well, I don't think you could call it an economy, but they did, for instance, have people who would go outside of the ghetto area and they would purchase some goods and then have stands where they would resell them within the sector. And I think there was a variety of goods that you could purchase that way if you were able to, but that's about as much as had happened.
Where would you get the money to make those purchases?
Where would you get the money to make those purchases?
Well, because you would have a laboring job, and we talked about my father being a musician, but actually for the first, I don't know, couple of 3 years, he worked in Chinese factories as a laborer, and so he would earn some money, and other people did similar jobs, I think, in order to get some source of income.
How often did you get other things to eat besides soup?
Oh, well, his grandma she was the powerhouse. She was shorter than me, and if she said, I'm going to walk through that wall, the family would say, stand back, Grandma's going to walk through the wall. Because she was a driving force in this family, and she's the one who found out about Shanghai. And she said, we're all going to Shanghai. That was that. And they had a little grocery store in Berlin. So once they got, and they had taken money with them. Gerda and John didn't have money. But when they got to Shanghai, they opened a little grocery store. And then she had her daughters, Gina, who was married to a cantor, Josef Schallenach, and her other daughter, who was your other? Oh, not Mushy.
No, Mushy would.
There was another one. Anyway, she sent them out in the morning to go shop at the Chinese vegetable markets. And they would, because they knew how to barter, because that's what you had to do. And then they would come back with all the vegetables. She would make them wash all the vegetables, and then she would put the vegetables out, and all the Jews and the Europeans there would come and shop at her store, even though the grandpa was there, it was her store. And so they made a good living, and they were good supporters of Henry and his parents. But it was, I mean, a lot of the people lived in that building that Henry talked about with the beds side by side. They had no other alternative. It was like you see refugee camps nowadays on TV, and people getting fed by UNRWA or whoever, and that's how many of them lived at that time.
My Opa was an entertainer.
Yeah, but Henry's father worked in the Chinese factories until such time as once the Japanese took over, that his friend said, you come and sing and play the drums.
Entertainer. So he would go out of the he would go out of the ghetto, entertain, and bring them money.
So he had money to buy food.
He had, yeah, and he was a very, like I said before, street smart person, and he got a pass from the Japanese guy to go out, and he'd be like, hi, how are you today? And he was just, he knew how to survive. In fact, on his gravestone, we have the words, a survivor, because that's what he really was. He was very much like his mother.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Yes.
Is the ghetto developed nowadays, or is it still very much out?
Is it developed nowadays? Or?
Is the ghetto developed?
Honkyu.
It's still pretty much a poor area. when we went, the communists, in fact, my mother-in-law had said when she came to this country, she had to keep her mouth shut because she said it was really good that the communists were coming in 1947. Because the conditions that the Chinese lived in were terrible. You know, she said you could get up in the morning, you'd go to work, and you'd step over dead bodies and dead babies. And there would be a guy that would come around and pick up all the bodies, and they'd take them and dump. I mean, you were either very poor or you were very rich. So that was what China was like at that time. And of course, we've actually been to China. It's pretty nice. We've been to Beijing and Shanghai and down south. So it's interesting,
I think
despite the politics.
I think there's another question.
Yes?
Another question.
No.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. Yes.
I just want to say one thing. I'm their daughter, their youngest. The best. I'm kidding. They just went to New York. Yeah, they were like, we're going to New York. Oh, sounds a good idea? Okay. And they met with a guy who works for a national Jewish organization. And somebody who he works with then found a letter that was sent for them to be able to get on the ship from Shanghai to the United States. And they brought that letter to that lunch that they just had literally within the last month. And that's the first time our family has seen that letter. And they, of course, sent me a copy of it. And, all of this takes my breath away in general because I can't necessarily understand it, or that I lived a very different life than them. But seeing that letter, to me, what it said was that the American Jewish community was here for my family. And the only way that they were able to come here was because somebody who didn't know them, who didn't care about them, they cared about them, but they didn't know them in a way, said, yep, we're going to sponsor this family to come to the United States. And that's the only reason why we're standing here right now. And there's so many people in this world that need that kind of support. And it really blew my, I was like, I need to print this thing. This is legitimately, here are the list of the families who can get on this ship. So imagine if you weren't on that list. I don't know what happened to those people, but I know what happened to my family, and it transformed, a family's life. And so I just wanted to add that part.
All right. Well, again, thank you very much. And I hope that it gave you a little different perspective about Holocaust because, usually Holocaust conjures up the concentration camp issue and the experience, but there were lots of other people affected by it. Thank you.
Thank you.